Hi everyone, Elliot Jacobson here. The topic of today's video is how to identify a card counter. So without further ado, let's get right to it. How to identify a card counter. Just to review, playing blackjack, you can get an edge over the house using card counting. However, your edge is very low. Card counters win by making large wagers. When the count they're using indicates they have the edge, they might also change how they play in certain situations according to the count. And each casino has to determine for itself how much of its resources, its game protection resources, it wants to divert to card counting. And this is always a question that I find is usually weighs in overabundance of too many resources expended on card counting. And once again, I hope to, by virtue of this video, dispel some of that nervousness. So essentially, card counting works because the game of blackjack has really two types of cards that the player is concerned about: good cards and bad cards. So just to review, the good cards, the cards the player is happy to have in the shoe, are going to be the high cards, 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace. These cards, when there's an abundance of them in the shoe, that favors the player. The player will get more blackjacks, obviously. When the player doubles down, he's going to get better cards on his double downs. And also the dealer, who is forced to hit until 17 or higher, in particular, will bust more often when they hit their 12 through 16. Conversely, the low cards, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are cards that favor the house. Well, when there's an abundance of those in the shoe, then obviously the player will get fewer blackjacks. The double downs the player makes will get worse cards, and the dealer, who is forced to hit on 12 through 16, will get more hands where they make their hand. So busting less often. So essentially, card counting is just based around identifying the relative proportion of good cards versus bad cards in the shoe. So I'm not going to cover how to count cards. There are plenty of books out there that allow you to do that. Just go to Amazon and type in blackjack card counting. I would recommend that you focus on the high-low card counting system. In particular, here's my book. Now, my book is no longer available on Amazon, but one thing that is true is that if you were to go to my website, advancedadvantageplay.com, and just scroll down this website, you will find that my book is available for download for free right here. You can download a PDF of my book. I made it available because my publisher passed away in 2019, and I took the book down from Amazon. I just can't find my way to putting it up there for any sort of price. There's just too many blackjack books. So if you want my book, it's available for free, and that will at the very least teach you the high-low card counting system. So go ahead and go to my website and just download a copy. So, all right, you know high-low card counting. I'm going to assume that you have some sense of what it is. You might not be proficient at it at the table or in any practical sense, but at least you have a good understanding of it. So just to kind of review the most important concepts about card counting, and these are about all you need if you want to identify card counters, is that blackjack card counting involves some sort of counting system, which means assigning what are known as tags to the various cards. So in high-low, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are given a +1, 7, 8, 9 are 0, 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace are a -1. There's many different counting systems out there, but one thing they all share in common is that they will give some sort of positive value to these low cards, 2 through 6. Sometimes a 7 is thrown in there, and negative values to the high card. Sometimes a 9 is thrown in that lot. So card counter is going to keep what's called a running count, whereas the cards are played out from the shoe. They're simply adding one, subtracting one. Whatever the card comes out, they start at 0 at the start of the shoe and adjust their count accordingly. Then there's this concept of the true count, which is where you divide the running count by the number of decks remaining in the shoe. And this kind of gives you a per deck estimation of an abundance or deficit of good cards. So the true count is a key number that a card counter will compute at the start of every hand, and will use that number to dictate their betting, their wager size, and possibly how they play their hand. So the next concept that you would learn in pretty much any book is you will have a bet ramp, which is essentially your wagers will go from a minimum bet at the start of the shoe to a maximum bet, which will depend on your bankroll and the edge that you can get over the house on the particular game you're playing. So a bet ramp is maybe a small amount on a single deck or much larger on a multi-deck game, but it again is something that you have to have if you want to beat Blackjack. Another thing is these so-called indices, which are simply numbers that will change how you play a particular hand based on the true count. So you might have a true count that you've computed for a hand, and you know an index, and depending on what that index is, it may change your play from a hit to a stand or from a hit to a double. All right, so we'll go through a couple of those in a minute. And then finally, there's this concept of Wonging, which may or may not be in the book that you've chosen. But Wonging simply is a way to talk about when to start playing a shoe or leave a shoe based on what the count is. So it's a method of avoiding large bet ramps by selectively entering and exiting play of the shoe. So let's just go into a little more detail about bet ramps. Again, the way that you beat Blackjack is by simply making larger wagers when you have the edge. And the indication is usually when the true count is greater than 1, that the edge will move to the player's size. Now, it might be 2 or 1, somewhere in that range. It will really depend on the rules of the game you're playing, where the exact break point will be for when you start to have the edge over the house. So the player simply will bet more as the true count goes up, and usually their maximum wager will happen when the true count is +4 or +5. And we look at this ratio of the player's smallest bet to their largest bet, and that's called their bet ramp. So if a player goes from $25 minimum bet to $100 maximum bet, that would be a bet ramp of 4-1. So the larger the ramp, then the more edge the player is going to get. So just as an example, if you are playing 6 decks, then the recommendation is that you should attempt to have a ramp of 12-1. For 2 decks, the 6-1 ramp is recommended. For single deck, the recommended ramp size is 4-1. And whenever possible, a card counter wants to always keep in mind that they can leave if the count goes negative, or they can wait to come into the game until the count is positive. In this way, they may avoid all situations playing a hand where the house has the edge, and that concept is called Wonging. And Wonging is essentially equivalent to having an infinite ramp, because you are never making a bet when the house has the edge over you. So the next concept, just to go over very quickly, are these very small subset of indices known as the illustrious 18. And this particular collection owes to the work of Don Schlesinger, who identified the most important strategic deviations a card counter needs to make to enhance its profitability. So let's just take a couple of examples here, and I'll show you how this works. So for example, if we were to look at this number right here, then what this tells us is that normally on a 9 versus a 7, the play would simply be to hit. But if the true count is +3 or higher, what this says to do is to double. So the point being that there are a lot more face cards, and so you're likely to get a good card, turn your 9 into a 19, the dealer 7 into a 17, and have a good chance of doubling, winning the double down. These two down here, 10-10 versus 5 or 6, are indicate that instead of standing, what we're going to do is split that hand. So the idea is that if there are a huge number of excess 10s, face cards, and aces, then you're likely to get good cards on your 10s when you split them, possibly turn them into 20s, or the dealer's more likely to bust his 5 or his 6. So there is a saying that only card counters and idiots split 10s. So it is definitely a tell if you see somebody splitting 10s that there may be something going on with that player where they may have some extra information. This other play that's very important is this one right up here. So card counters will take insurance when well, if we think about what insurance is simply a side bet that the dealer's down card, the card under the up facing ace, is a face card. So this is simply a side bet that pays 2 to 1 if the dealer turns over a face card. Well, when the true count is sufficiently high, that means there's an excess of face cards, and so the player is more likely to win this bet, and it becomes profitable when the true count is +3 or higher. I should point out that these numbers right here for a 6-deck shoe game, which is the focus of this presentation anyway. So these two plays in particular, the insurance play and the splitting 10s, are two of the biggest tells that you may have a card counter. It's just very rare to see a player, for example, insure an 8 and a 5 against a dealer's ace. Well, a card counter would do that if the count was high enough. Meanwhile, a card counter would not insure his 20 against the dealer's ace if the count was negative. So it's a big tell when you take insurance. It's a big tell splitting face cards. All right. Now, just to be clear, I just want to make sure we all understand that card counting is not a profitable way to play against blackjack. And we see that with work, again, that comes out of Blackjack Attack by Don Schlesinger, where if we looked at just a 6-deck shoe game with double on anything and a typical card counter who has a $100 max bet, and we're just going to say that that person has an 8 to 1 bet ramp, and they're using the illustrious 18 that I indicated, and possibly 4 additional indices when surrender is offered, then what we can see is that the amount that the person's earning is just fairly low, and in particular this number right here, $15.50, is the typical number that arises for probably the most common game that is offered in every casino, which is a 6-deck shoe game with the cut card placed 1.5 decks from the end and a hit 17 rule and no surrender offered. So with a $100 max bet, most people in the casino industry may believe that person's winning $100, $200, $300 an hour. The truth is they're barely making minimum wage with their $100 max bet. And if anything, again, I'm just trying to encourage a little bit of thoughtful reflection about how your casino or a casino expends their game protection resources. So let's now figure out how to identify card counters. Well, our card counters that we're looking at, sort of the prototypical card counter, this is what they want. They want to play alone, right? They want to have the game just move as quickly and as efficiently as possible. They want to get as many hands in as quickly as possible. Each hand means possibly more income, so they're not going to be distracting the dealer or trying to cause any problems. They just want to play the game. And this is sort of a commonly held view of card counters that they just want to get down to business. They're working, so they just want to get in and play the hands. You may see them have a large bet spread, especially at shoe games. They probably don't want to get rated. They don't want to give up their identity, so they're not going to be on the books. They're not going to play side bets, bets that have a strong house edge that just won't get played. The exception to that is if the side bet itself can be card counted, then they may be playing that side bet. That's a whole different topic, but typically you will not see card counters playing side bets. Many of them won't tip. There's no reason to give up their profitability to the dealer, and tipping is anathema to many in the card counting community, and there are discussions online about not tipping. So you can certainly read a lot of very, enthusiastic non-tippers making their case if you go looking for it on some of the websites. They will leave the table in negative counts, and so you may see them taking phone calls, having to tie their shoes, getting up to stretch, going to the bathroom, flagging down a waitress for a drink, anything to get out of playing hands when the count is negative and they know the house has the edge. So card counters, another sort of commonly held belief about them is that they want to sit at third base, and the reason for that is they will have as many cards as possible played before the play comes around to them, so that they can use that additional information to affect how they may play their hand. So card counters in the best possible world would like to sit at third base, but there are some plays card counters make that draw attention to themselves. For example, hitting 12 versus 6 in a negative count, where the table may erupt with anger at that counter and draw attention to that person, so they may not like to be at third base, where you get that extra attention for how you play. So again, it's really up to the counter, but typically if it's possible, that's the seat of choice for the card counter. Also, we can look at card counters, how they're playing their hands, and we don't need to keep track of the count. All we need to do is observe their bet spread, and if a card counter is at the top range of their bet spread, then you could just assume that that means the count is highly positive. And so the way they play their hands will change according to what you should do when there's a high count. So you're going to double more often. Again, 9 versus 7 was at +3 as we indicated. They're going to stand on their stiff hands, their 15s and 16s, possibly against a 9, 10, or ace. They may do these powerful splits, for example, splitting 10s. They may ensure bad hands, as we indicated before, 8, 5 versus ace. You may see the counters spread to multiple hands. This is a common way to get more money on the table with less risk. So counters, rather than going from $25 to $300, a 12-to-1, may go from $25 to 2 hands of $200, get more money on the table with less risk, if possible. And it may be that there's a team at work, so you certainly want to watch out. If a player has a large wager out, does another player come in with a very large wager at that time to the table? And that may be the indication that he's been called in. So conversely, when there's a small bet out, you may see our card counter not doubling 9 versus 3, 10 versus 9, hitting their 12 against 4, 5, and 6. Again, with a negative count, those hits become the correct play. They won't take insurance even if they have a 20 against the dealer's ace. It's just, you don't take insurance. They may pull back their multiple hands down to one hand. Again, they may find any reason they can to leave the table after the hand. Now, All of these things make it pretty easy to identify card counters, and so as a consequence, card counters have to use some sort of camouflage to attempt to hide what they're doing. And there are all sorts of sort of standard ways of attempting to disguise yourself as a card counter. So, for example, at the start of the shoe, rather than starting with your minimum bet, maybe start with a wager that's in the middle or towards your larger bet. And then what can happen is if after a few hands the count goes negative, then the counter can lower their wager down to their minimum bet. So rather than exposing their full bet ramp, possibly they'll go from $100 starting bet down to $25 or $100 up to $300. And in that way, it doesn't look like they have the full range of their betting ramp by starting at sort of this intermediate value. So another thing is that for example, when a person raises or lowers their bet, there's a certain psychology to that you become used to seeing other players do, and part of that psychology is you raise your bet after wins, you lower your bet after losses. Now a card counter may just be raising and lowering according to the count. So they may win a big bet, but a lot of face cards and aces come out, so then they would lower their bet. Well, that looks really funny to just suddenly win a lot of money and then lower your bet. So likewise, if you go on a long losing streak and then suddenly a lot of small cards come out and you raise your bet, a lot of players after a whole sequence of losses will definitely not want to, they believe in the streaks. They will definitely not want to be raising their bets, but the counter may. So there is this strategy that some adhere to, which is as a counter, only raise your bet after you win, only lower your bet after you lose. They may play a counter basic strategy. So for example, if we look at the hand 12 versus 3, that's a hand that of course the correct play is hit, but when the count gets high enough, the correct play becomes stand. Now the typical player, novice, will always stand on 12 versus 3. They just believe you should always stand against bus cards when you have 12 through 16. And that becomes the correct play when the counter has his large bet out. So the counter may just always stand on that hand because it's the wrong play when he has his small bet out, but it's the right play when he has his large bet out. So in the long run, there's more value in not creating the disturbance at the table by how you play that hand. So yeah, that's called counter basic strategy. Again, you may be part of a team using a big player strategy. So that's, you may see players just betting minimum at the table, but they're keeping count, and the team is at various tables around the pit, and there is a high roller jumping from table to table as he's being called into positive shoes. That strategy was perfected by Kenny Houston in the late 1970s. We're certainly going to see card counters with unusual acts. I'll cover a couple of those acts in a moment. They may fake being drinking alcohol. So for example, you might find a counter ordering a beer. When the beer gets delivered, he'll take it into a bathroom, he'll empty out the bottle, refill it with water, and come back to the table. He wants to give the impression that he's drinking even though he's not. And of course, the counter may want to be disguising his appearance, and that disguise may involve wearing hat and sunglasses. That's very typical, sort of stereotypical counter behaviors, to be disguised like that. All right, so here is one problem that many counters have. They have to have a story. So it is likely, if they're betting big or winning a lot, that at some point pit boss will come up to them and just talk to them, ask them for a playing card, ask where they're from, just start a casual conversation. So it's always important to counters to have a story. And here's a couple of the stories that I've run into. A newly married couple on their honeymoon, I saw this team spread from $25 to close to $5,000 on a single shoe. Marijuana grower with a lot of cash. There are jurisdictions in Oregon, Washington State, Northern California, where that is definitely something that certain times a year people just come in with a lot of cash and play anyway, and that is a good opportunity for a certain type of act to work. A businessman at a conference, a high roller having fun and partying. Again, that was Ken Houston's MO when he was part of his team. And then you may have somebody, a big tell is if you look at the playing records for a person. Counters typically don't want to be in a casino for very long. They know the longer they're there, the more their play will get scrutinized. So does the player always have a hit and run style to them? Are they playing for just a couple shoes? Are they just exposing their big bet once or twice and then leaving? Are they always in a hurry? So you will see that as part of their story as well. So, okay, summary of card counting tells. They're going to spread their bet through a wide range, possible, or be Wonging. They're going to take insurance when their maximum bet is out, regardless of their hand. They're going to make strong doubles when their maximum bet is out. They may double their 10 versus a 10 or an 8. They may hit their 12 versus a 4, 5, or 6, or 13 versus 2 and 3 when their minimum bet is out. They may sit or leave the table after making several minimum bets, play alone, not play rated, not drink alcohol, use some sort of camouflage. So all of these are tells that someone has been card counting. And lastly, there is software available to help identify card counters. I am not an advocate of using this software because, as I've indicated before, the profitability of card counting is very, very low. In fact, I think you should just let card counters play up to a certain limit, call it $100 or maybe $200, whatever you care about in your casino. It's just not worth expending the game protection effort to identify every low-level card counter who may or may not be profitable. If your casino has some big action and you have not yet trained your staff on how to identify card counters, then as a last resort, such software may be useful, but I think it's easy enough to identify card counters that software really isn't necessary. Just a little bit of experience, you can usually identify who's counting cards in just a couple of hands. Much easier than you think. So, my personal opinion, card counting is one of the least effective ways of beating the house. Most card counters are either not winning or they're just barely winning. So you may not be able to tell where they are in that spectrum, but if they're not betting very much, then the answer is just let them play. By obsessing over card counters, many casinos fail to adequately protect their games against much stronger methods, not only advantage play, cheating, theft, collusion, and everything else that can be going on. So just not important to watch card counters who are playing at a low level. There should be a policy to let card counters play. Just don't even look at the person if they're not betting a sufficient amount. Well, up to a point. If they may be hole carding or using some other method and getting a huge edge. So yes, even at $100 level, a hole carder can do a lot of damage. But that's a whole different question to examine. It's not really associated with the topic of this video. So finally, those who hype card counting on social media, and you'll see it if you go around, all of the gambling websites talk about card counting. Just because the majority of the information out there is about card counting does not mean that card counting is a dangerous method of beating the house. So don't let all of this information, the abundance of it out there, all the hype, all the books, all of the bulletin boards, all of the appearance of card counting in your favorite movies change your opinion, because your opinion should be based on facts, and the facts are that card counting is a very weak and barely profitable method to beat the house. All right, everybody, so that is the end of this video. If you want to see more videos, please visit my website, advancedadvantageplayer.com, You can find out how to contact me there as well.